In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
There are those rare people who don't just witness history, they live inside it. Nancy Shear is one of them. For more than 2 decades, she was at the very heart of America's classical music world, an orchestra librarian, broadcaster, and insider who worked alongside the giants of the 20th century. As a young woman in the 1950s, she slipped into the Philadelphia Orchestra's rehearsals through the stage door at age 15, joined the library staff at 17, and by 18 was assisting the legendary Leopold Stokowski himself. In a new memoir, I Knew a Man Who Knew Brahms, Nancy invites readers behind the curtain of a golden age in classical music, into the rehearsal rooms, backstage corridors, and private lives of figures like Stokowski, Ormandy, and others. With candor, wit, and a historian's precision, she reveals the brilliance and the ego, the art of the argument, the intimate humanity behind the grandeur of the concert stage. Nancy Shear, what a treasure. What a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Terry. It's a pleasure.
What drew you to the orchestra at such a young age?
Looking back on it, I would say that back then it was music itself. It was the sound of the orchestra. It was the great expression of orchestral music. It was the emotionality of it. I can go through all of these things. So back then, I think that's really what the magnet was. But now, from the perspective of an older person, not old, but older, I think a lot of it also was the orchestra itself was sort of a family. And I sensed that they all got together for this one purpose of uniting to make music. All of these different people, and I came from a very difficult home life. So I think part of it was a subconscious, unconscious desire to be part of this, in effect, family. It was a professional family by choice and by profession. So I think that was part of it. But really, it was the music. If the music hadn't been so powerful and so extraordinarily beautiful and wonderful, I probably would not have been attracted to that world the way I was, and still am. It's been 60 years, and I'm still obsessed with it. It's incredible.
You were hired as a library assistant at 17 and became Leopold Stokowski's musical assistant a year later. An astonishing leap. What do you remember most vividly about that time?
Well, it's really interesting that when you look back then, we didn't have the security that we have today. So a kid could hang out at the stage door and sit on the steps and just stand there for a couple of weeks on end. And then you could, when Eugene Ormandy passed by one day, he was, of course, the music director and conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and just stopped. He said, "I see you here every week. What are you doing here?" And I said, "I love the orchestra." I didn't tell him anymore. And he said, "Do you have a ticket?" And I said, "No." I didn't say I couldn't afford it or my parents didn't have the money, none of that. I just said no. And he said, "Come with me." And he took me backstage and got me a ticket from the woman at the box office whom I had sort of been bothering for probably a couple of months by then. And it was really adorable because he called her and he said, "I'm sending a friend of mine. Can you please give her a ticket?" When I showed up, she said, "You?" She said, "You couldn't afford a ticket a couple of weeks ago. Now you're Eugene Ormandy's friend." It was very, very funny and almost like a fairy tale, But after that, when I went backstage with Ormandy, I had learned the backstage layout. So I knew how to get from the entrance, the street entrance, back to where there was a doorway where I had already bypassed ticket takers. So nobody, when I got through that doorway, nobody would say, "May I see your ticket?" or "Where are you sitting?" I didn't do. So I was able to get back there. I think after 2001 with the World Trade Center, everything changed and it became a little less personal, a little less passionate, more official, and certainly more secure. So I don't know today if a kid, a young person, a 15-year-old could so easily wander around backstage now.
Our perception of some of those classical music greats are people who were both brilliant and could be difficult. What was it like navigating those personalities?
I didn't find them difficult, and I don't know why. I mean, Stokowski, like Toscanini, was one of the terrifying conductors. And that was a day when conductors ruled by force. These weren't nice guys. You didn't call them by their first names. And they were dictators. And in classical music, that wasn't such a horrible thing. We're not talking about government today. We're not talking about rulers of countries. We're talking about a man, and it was usually a guy in those days, a strong man who got up on the podium and dominated those 100 people in front of him. Very few women. So they were dictators, but as far as the music was concerned, they considered it the best thing for the music. Other conductors, and there were some of them, were able to get the great results through kindness and through sweetness. But these were monumental personalities. I didn't find them difficult. And I think a lot of these people were probably fascinated or maybe charmed by a very young girl who was obsessed with the music, and it was never anything else. And it was just the music. So if I had the opportunity to meet some of these people, and I pretty much created the opportunities, I wanted to ask them why they did certain things. I was amazed. Why did they slow the music where they did? Why did they speed it up afterward? And I did that with Stokowski the first time he let me into a rehearsal. And he took the time to open his score and point to the section where that I had asked about, where he had slowed the orchestra. So I think a lot of these people were also very happy to share their art with the younger generation, which of course would help, if not ensure, that their legacy and the classical music would live on.
How do you think the role of women in classical music has evolved since those early years?
Oh, I think it's much different than it used to be, but it still has a way to go. You know, a couple of years ago, there was a real milestone. The New York Philharmonic suddenly had the majority of its members were female. Now imagine that. So when I sort of connected myself to the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was around 1962, they hired me in 1964, there were only 4 women in the orchestra itself. One was a violinist, one was the great cellist, Elsa Hilger, who was my teacher, and the other 2 were harpists. And that was new because Stokowski put the first woman, if I remember correctly, in the Philadelphia Orchestra who was a woman in any orchestra. So, and she was a harpist. But even before then, the harpists were men. So imagine today that if you have, let's say, 104 people in a symphony orchestra, New York Philharmonic is probably around 100, maybe a few more. But the majority of the players are suddenly women. So that's making progress.
Our special guest is Nancy Shear. We're talking about her new book, I Knew the Man Who Knew Brahms. Her website is Nancy, Shear, nancyshear.com. What did you learn from observing the creative process up close?
There are two kinds of creative processes, and one is really the creative process, which is the composition, composing music. The second is recreative, and that is performing it. But that can be done very creatively. In fact, some people say a little too creatively. And that's one of the things that my mentor and hero, Leopold Stokowski, was criticized for. People said he didn't do things as strictly as he should, that he would play with the music a little more than he should have, that what you heard as a result was not just what the composer wanted, but also what Stokowski wanted. So he would take what we call liberties with the music. So that was really being creative in a way that some people said was not what he should have been doing. It was not appropriate. Other people disagree. So the creative process, which was the composer, and the recreative, which is the interpretive, they're very different, but they can both be very creative. So I guess what I personally learned from that was to keep trying, to keep at it. And that's what I heard in rehearsals, especially with people like Stokowski. If it didn't work one way, you tried another. And I would sometimes I was completely alone. It was 100 players in the Philadelphia Orchestra on the stage, and I was the only human being in the hall. I mean, imagine that when you're 17. It's like, wow. And I'd look around me in the concert hall. I'd look up to the what they call the Peanut Gallery, the amphitheater of the beautiful Academy of Music in Philadelphia. And I'd look at the seat, which was behind a pole, because nobody wanted to buy that seat. So it was usually empty. So I would sneak into the concerts and I'd run up the steps and I'd go up there, and there was less of a chance that I'd be kicked out because nobody wanted to buy that seat behind the pole. But from there, and then when I really became intimate with the layout of the Academy of Music, and the orchestra would allow me to sit in on the rehearsals. And then when I was 17, it was my job to sit on those rehearsals. Greatest gift, I think, of my life, being able to hear these incredible, legendary musicians. They were legends while they were still alive. That's the amazing thing. But what I loved was just the turn of a phrase, an emphasis on one note rather than on another, a certain change in the loudness or the softness, just the little tiny changes that made a huge difference in what the listener heard and how the listener would react. I thought that was a great lesson in living life.
Stokowski has such a mythic reputation. What was he like behind the legend?
Well, let's see. A lot of my book is about Stokowski. And the book is 104,000 words. So it's not easy. But in a way it is to describe him. He was awe-inspiring. He had a regal presence. He was, especially to a 15, 16, 17-year-old, he was like a god. Because as anyone who has seen Fantasia can attest to, he had this huge personality, and he was handsome, and he was 6'2", and he had this mane of white hair, and this very erect posture, and he was awesome. So that was remarkable, but it did not encourage intimacy. And certainly he was not like some other musicians where you could run up to him and say, "Oh, can I have your autograph?" And he'd say, "Of course," and hand it to you. And there'd be a little bit of bantering, not with Leopold Stokowski. There was a severity, and yet his personality, somehow, it just seemed to me that there was something else going on. There was a little opening there. And as I write about in the book, I was desperate to hear his rehearsal in February of 1964. And my boss, I was already working for the orchestra. My boss said, no, nobody's allowed into that rehearsal. Nobody can come in. Not the family of the orchestra members, not the staff of the Philadelphia Orchestra, no one. And he said, you won't be allowed in because no one is allowed. He said you'd have to somehow ask him. So I waited outside, freezing February day in Philadelphia, and I waited for his car to arrive about a half hour before the rehearsal. And this, I'm not sure if it was a taxi or a black car, pulled up, and he got out of the car. And it was awesome because, he was so tall, and he sort of kept getting out of the car because he was so handsome and such a large presence. And when he started to walk through the stage door, I ran after him, and he stopped. He was shocked, and he turned around and he said, I said, Maestro, may I come into your rehearsal? And he didn't say a word, but he motioned with his hand that I should precede him into through the doorway, the stage doorway. And when we got in, he bent down and he said, why do you want to hear my rehearsal? And as excellent as my memory is, almost like a videotape, I cannot remember what I said to him. But I do remember that he laughed, which was not a typical Stokowski response at all. And then he said, what instrument do you play? And I said, I play the cello. And he said, good. And he said, I will allow you to come into my rehearsal on one condition. And I said, what is that? And he said, you must come backstage after the rehearsal and tell me your impressions. So I took this very seriously, Terry. I mean, really. And I said, yes, I will do that. I will come backstage. And at the end of the 2.5 hour rehearsal, which was so remarkable, hearing and seeing what he did to change the texture of the orchestra, the approach, the interpretation, how he would get the orchestra members to make these changes. And a lot of it was not verbal. It was just very physical, his breathing, his hand movements, and most of all, I would find out later, his eyes, which was remarkable. So I went charging back to the dressing room and knocked on the door. He was alone. He answered. And we started to talk. He said, what did you think of the rehearsal? I said, it was remarkable. Thank you for letting me sit in on that. But I didn't understand something you did I think it was near the end of the first movement of the Shostakovich Fifth. And I said, you slowed the orchestra. And I had never heard it that way on records. And I said, why did you do that? And instead of, getting me out of the dressing room and telling me it was none of my business or being harsh, he was very sweet. And he opened his score and he pointed to that section. And he explained a little bit about the music and why he slowed it at that point. And that was it. So, and then I was sort of dismissed. And there was another rehearsal of his, and I decided I was going to go to that one too. But I didn't ask permission. And when he saw me, he smiled and he waved, and that was it for the rest of his life. I was welcomed into any rehearsal he had anywhere.
You've said that this book is a literary welcome mat to the world of classical music. How do you make it accessible to readers who may not read a note of music?
They don't have to. And this is such a fallacy among listeners, because I talk to people all the time. And I just spoke to a Zoom book club, and we were talking, and I said, you have as much right to that seat in the concert hall as a music critic does, as a musician does, as a music student does, by somebody who knows an encyclopedic amount about music. You have the same right to occupy that seat as anybody on the planet. And that is a true statement. You do not need to know anything to come into a concert hall and open your ears, open your heart. I know that sounds sentimental, but that's how it is. And be receptive to what you're listening to. And if somebody wants to listen emotionally, bravo. Bravo. Why not? Why not? But however anyone wants to listen, they can listen. They can get just as much out of it as anyone else. If they choose to learn more about it, would it be more rewarding? It might be, because they have that need. But do they have to know something technically about music to love it and to be so enlightened by it and made happy by it? No. And that's why this book is a welcome, Matt. But come on in and listen.
Was there a particular story in the book that felt especially emotional for you to revisit?
That's a great question. There are a lot of stories. In fact, the book really is one story after the other. I guess the story that I really love, that doesn't have to do anything with the listening to the music. I could give you dozens that do, but I guess the one that touched me a lot was I was working alone in the library of the orchestra, and a conductor, very well known, very beloved too, but he was a bit of a ladies' man. And in those days, we had never heard of the Me Too movement. And conductors, we knew what conductors' tricks were, and that was usually to approach a woman in a way that she was not comfortable or happy with. But I was working alone in the library backstage at the Academy of Music, and it was intermission in the rehearsal. And I saw, as usual, there were a lot of players up in the library, and they were getting the music for future concerts that they had to learn. They had to practice at home on their own before they came together as an ensemble on the stage as the Philadelphia Orchestra. So they would come up, they'd get their music, they'd tell jokes, they'd complain about conductors, which every orchestra on the planet does. And but I saw that they were looking at each other in a very strange way. And the bell rang to call them back on stage, and not all of them immediately left. And then I actually saw one player glance at the other and sort of nod a little bit. And I said, that's it. I said, what's going on here? And there were, I guess, 4 or 5 orchestra players still up there. I said, what's happening? Something is going on. Oh, no. I said, no, something is going on. And finally, one of them said to me, so-and-so is conducting today, and he doesn't have a very good reputation. And we wanted to be sure that you wouldn't be alone in case he came up here to visit. And they were protecting me. And I think that's quite beautiful, that a 17, 18, 19-year-old girl, I don't know if I was a woman at that point. I certainly was a girl. I needed protection from some of these conductors. I wasn't aware of it, but the players in the orchestra were, and they protected me. So I think as far as an emotional charge is concerned, that meant a lot to me. It really did. And that's why the book is dedicated to Leopold Stokowski and to the men and women of the Philadelphia Orchestra then and now, because they've carried that beautiful tradition, certainly to the present time, of playing magnificently for anyone who's on that podium.
What did you learn about yourself in the process of writing I Knew a Man Who Knew Brahms?
That's another great question. I hadn't even thought of it. Never thought of myself as being really strong, but I think a lot of people who have read the book, even strangers have been in touch with me. They've emailed and they've called, and people have said, wow, it took a lot of courage. I never saw it as courage. I wanted to get in. I said to a friend, there is no doorway and no lock strong enough to keep me out of the concert hall. That's how badly I wanted to get in to hear that music. So did it take courage to sneak in? What did I have to lose? I don't know. There was a chance that I could hear the orchestra if I snuck into the concert hall, but there would be no chance if I hadn't. So that took courage. Coming from a troubled family, I think I needed to have courage and to overcome that. So I guess, but I suspect that a lot of us have courage that we don't acknowledge, that we don't feel until after we've taken those steps. So I guess that's something I learned about myself, that I did have a bit of courage that has taken me places that have been wonderful.
We're talking with Nancy Shear about her extraordinary memoir, I Knew a Man Who Knew Brahms. NancyShear.com is her website. You spent a lifetime bringing people closer to classical music as a librarian, lecturer, broadcaster, and now a memoirist. What do you hope readers will take away from your story?
The accessibility of classical music. And one person that I met, I'm meeting a lot of young people, and I hope to meet a lot more young people through this book. That's the demographic. I would love for them to know more about music. But I just hope that through this book, they can come into this world and make it their own. It's there. It's there.
The book is I Knew a Man Who Knew Brahms, written by Nancy Shear, a former librarian for the Philadelphia Orchestra who was in the right place at the right time to witness amazing history. NancyShear.com is her website. Nancy, thanks so much for the conversation.
It's been a total delight. Thank you, Terry.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.